IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another Friday episode of All Things Policy. Today we're going to be talking about something related to the Seleucids and a Hellenistic empire upon which we did an episode a few weeks ago. Now, the Seleucids were successors of Alexander the Great, arguably one of the most famous humans who's ever lived, and a conqueror as important to the overall flow of human history as, for example, Genghis Khan. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is something that both the Seleucids and Alexander had in common, and that is arguably one of the most influential military tactics of the ancient world. This was the phalanx. Now, a phalanx is basically a whole bunch of men packed together, holding spears to stab at people who are in front of them. But as we're going to see over the course of this episode, there are a lot of ways to really make the phalanx an absolutely deadly tool of war. And then in the second half of this episode, what we're going to talk about is how is it that this phalanx, at one point, the most effective tactic that kind of reigned over most of the Eastern Mediterranean and helped bring the Macedonians and the Greeks to dominate much of Persia, parts of Central Asia, and even the Indian subcontinent. How was it that this extraordinarily influential military tactics was finally brought to its knees, as it were, by an upstart power based in the Western Mediterranean, namely that of Rome? To discuss this with me today, I have with me Aditya Ramanathan. Welcome, Aditya.
Thank you, Anirudh.
So let's begin, Aditya, by trying to understand broadly how the phalanx evolved. What really is a phalanx? What was the earliest form of a phalanx like? Why did that not work? And what did it gradually evolve into under the Macedonians?
Sure. If you look at a movie, for example, typical movie or TV show, how do infantry fight? It's a bunch of people who get intermingled with each other. There's a big melee. Everybody swings swords and axes, and there's dramatic music, and so on. So that's basically how it's depicted in a lot of popular culture. That is not typically how people on foot, used to fight in the past. So, before the phalanx, people would typically form loose swarms. They would, throw javelins at each other, maybe use bows and arrows. Occasionally, somebody would, venture out and attack somebody else in a line and come back. People didn't, you didn't have these forces of people just randomly intermingling, right? It makes no sense. People are not suicidal, and you don't know what objective you're going to achieve out of that chaos. So, phalanx is really one of the ways of bringing both order and great deal of deadly effectiveness to the chaos of warfare in the ancient world. And the phalanx is, typically with, it's associated with ancient Greece. And of course, ancient Greece was, get very important phalanxes arising there. But the phalanx is really old. It goes back to the beginnings of the Bronze Age, the so-called stelae of vultures from Sumer. You see clear depictions of phalanxes. You see people in lines, wielding spears, forming shield walls. A phalanx is essentially a close order formation that is characterized by a few things: some amount of armor, spears or pikes, so some sort of pole arms, and typically also shields. Now you can also get rid of those shields, if you're using large pole arms like pikes. So, get rid of the shields or have smaller shields. But if you're using spears, if you just say your right hand you have a spear, your left hand you're going to have a shield of some sort, and you will have some way of basically locking shields together and create some sort of close order formation. This is not completely mysterious to us in the sense that you see, for example, riot police doing something very similar even today, forming ranks and files. So you have some people, locking shields right in the front where they're meeting the rioters, and you have others in the background, in the back, also doing the same and essentially providing a forward momentum to the riot policemen in the front. So the phalanx, in that sense, survives in a sort of husk of its original form even today.
And it's hard to underestimate just how influential and almost just how natural a formation of phalanx is. Inevitably, if you have a whole bunch of people out to fight a whole bunch of other people, you are going to organize them in a way that's very, very similar to a phalanx, because it's a very efficient way of concentrating the mass of your unit together while also presenting a threat to anybody who's going to tackle you from the front. In fact, if you look at hero stones from modern day Karnataka, for example, stuff that was very often made about 1,000 years ago, perhaps a little more than that, you will see what appear to be depictions of phalanxes. Of course, they're very different from the Greek phalanx. These are not people who are wearing a lot of armor. Not very often, they're not even using spears, but rather using straight leaf-shaped swords. But it's more or less like a universal thing. If you're interested in the evolution of South Indian infantry warfare, then I can recommend the podcast that Aditya and I host together. It's called Yuddha, the Indian Military History Podcast. Specifically, episode 2 is where we talk about just how influential South Indian infantry warfare has been in the history of the subcontinent. But coming back to the topic at hand today, we've mentioned that phalanxes are more or less universal. You find them all over the world. It's very often used in organized warfare by states from the very beginning of civilization to the present day. But there was one particular region, namely ancient Greece, where the phalanx took on a very distinctive and very effective form. So, Aditya, can you tell us what is it that the phalanx really lacks? What are its vulnerabilities? And how did exposure to those vulnerabilities lead to the development of a more effective sort of phalanx under the Macedonians?
Sure. So the Greek phalanx turns out, in some respects, to be an extraordinarily effective way of fighting. We don't know exactly what form the phalanx took, for example, during the Persian invasions of Greece in 480, 479. There's a lot of, by the way, there's endless academic debate about all of this. But it was probably a factor in the eventual Persian defeat during that expedition. So in that sense, it's a remarkably effective way of fighting. But soon after that, especially during the conflict we call the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC, you start seeing some of the problems with the phalanx. One most obvious problem is, I don't actually have to fight in a phalanx, right? I can just be like we talked about having these loose order formations. This is actually an even more natural way to fight, and this is typically how, for most of human history, including the pre-agrarian times, this is how people are sort of fought, right? You fight, you ambush, you surprise someone, you move around in loose swarms, you attack and run away. Now, if you do this and you keep effectively peppering a phalanx with javelins, with slings, with arrows, and so on, it becomes very vulnerable. And the phalanx by itself does not have a response to that. A phalanx is very effective if it manages to actually close the distance with this light infantry, with these clouds of people. But these clouds of skirmishers can also just run away, right? And they're typically less encumbered by armor and so on. So they can just run away much more fast. It's very hard for you to catch up with them. So that was one very obvious problem with the phalanx. So what you start seeing in this period is that the Greek city-states start developing. Everybody starts getting skirmishers of their own, basically, in order to ward off the other skirmishers. And if you manage to defeat the other guy's skirmishers, you turn your skirmishers on the enemy's phalanx as well. The other problem that starts appearing is that if a phalanx is very vulnerable on its sides. The very fact that you're using pole arms, that you're using spears, means it's kind of and in close order formation. It's really kind of hard to turn from one direction to another. The phalanx cannot really fight 360 degrees. So that is another potential problem with the phalanx. Finally, there's just a matter of tactical innovation. During the period of the Peloponnesian Wars and the wars of the 4th century BC that follow, you start seeing a lot of military innovation. You start seeing, for example, the Athenians say, well, why don't we just outrange these guys, right? Instead of using this typical 8.5-foot spear, let's just make a 16-foot spear, right? We'll get them even before they manage to close the distance with us. Then you have guys like Epaminondas in Thebes who basically say, a lot of the core of phalanx is really, packing it with people and basically being able to push the enemy where it matters most. So he basically overloads, if you will, one side of his phalanx line with, it's 50 men deep instead of 8 men deep. And the very front ranks are professional soldiers. he manages in the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC to smash through the Spartan right, where the Spartan king is, and the Spartan king is killed. And he also deploys his phalanx in an oblique, so that by the time the rest of the Spartans can get there and try and attack his phalanx, one side has already been rolled up. So, you have all these tactical innovations going on. And so these tactical innovations in turn propel Greeks and Macedonian people or Macedonian people who are also Greek-like or heavily Hellenized people to start thinking about, wait, what are the ways in which we can develop perhaps new kinds of weaponry, new kinds of organization to, destroy these typical Greek city-state phalanxes. Now, how this exactly happens is once again a matter of endless academic debate. A lot of people credit it to Philip II, the Macedonian king and father of Alexander III or Alexander the Great. But there are lots of competing theories that the Macedonians that for example that there were earlier Macedonian kings who started instituting some of these reforms, that they learned them from the Balkans, they're from Egypt. There are all sorts of theories. Typically, the most commonly heard theory is that Philip II himself, in his own interactions with both the Athenians and the Thebans, learned some of these tactics and incorporated them into his own army. Very briefly, what the core of this new Macedonian pike phalanx is, as the name suggests, instead of having that 8.5 foot spear, you basically move that 16-foot spear or maybe 23-foot spear. Basically a much longer spear or pike of the sort that the Athenians had experimented with. And this basically allows you to completely outrange your enemy. Now, this is not a one-handed weapon. This is a two-handed weapon. It's a pike. So you need to hold it with both your hands, which means you can't really have a big shield anymore. You can't, form the shield wall as you did in the past. So you basically have a much smaller shield, which rests on either part of your upper arm or part of your forearm on your left arm. So basically, this is a formation that is meant to be used offensively, and it's not something that is, somebody armed in this way is not really going to excel at individual combat, but when packed together in a formation, you basically create this porcupine, basically a military porcupine that just can slice and cut through entire formations of enemies.
That sounds, frankly, that sounds absolutely terrifying. Imagine having 256 pointy things pointed straight at you, and you look at this very intimidating bunch of guys who are armored basically to the teeth, who are advancing at you slowly but inexorably, as if they're going to trample you or impale you. Must have been absolutely terrifying. But also, Aditya, the phalanx, even though it's a very heavy and immobile sort of formation, is also working with a whole bunch of other things on Macedonian battlefields to make it insanely effective, right? On the one hand, you have, for example, the famous companion cavalry, as they were called, basically Macedonian aristocrats who were raised along with the heirs of the Macedonian king to fight alongside him. And these guys were a highly mobile shock cavalry force who would work alongside the phalanxes. And you also had, of course, the peltas, who are basically light infantry who are also capable of hand-to-hand combat, but basically are very, very good at harassing enemies. So essentially, it's very interesting to see how, because of these competitive pressures, where you have phalanx facing phalanxes, so you have this arms race, as it were, and you have these new tactics that are being developed. You have these new ways of fighting that are developed that finally culminate in this extremely organized form of combined arms warfare, which essentially uses the mass of these heavy, unbreakable phalanxes along with the well-directed mass of these cavalry squadrons to maneuver blocks of enemy units around the battlefield and essentially hit them where it hurts, get them to start running away, and thus trigger a mass rout and then inflict extremely heavy casualties on them. It's a really extraordinary system. We very often think of military innovation as something that began with gunpowder, but we can very clearly see that happening in the ancient world as well. And of course, since I will always be plugging to, if you guys want to hear about another innovative form of using directed mass to kind of smash and rout enemies, you should listen to episode 1 of Yuddha, where we talk about the Indian war elephant. But coming back to the Macedonians once again, Can you give us an example of how the Macedonians used all these features, Aditya, to break and rout absolutely massive armies? Can you, for example, briefly tell us about the Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander the Great defeated arguably the most numerous army in the world at the time, the Persian army?
Sure. What you see in battles like Gaugamela and also in the Battle of Issus is the classic use of what is typically called the hammer and anvil, right? So in this case, the anvil would be the Macedonian or Macedonian pike-phalanx, and the hammer would be that companion cavalry. So at Gaugamela, what the Macedonians did was that you would have the pike-phalanx advancing towards the Persians, along with a screen of light infantry. So this light infantry would engage with the Persian light infantry. They would pepper the enemy, and then they would dissolve back into their own ranks. And then the pike phalanx would move right into the Persians. Now the Persians could fend them off with their shields, try and cut off pikes, but they would be inexorably almost pushed back. It's very difficult to counter a pike phalanx frontally. Now, while this is happening, while these Persians are pinned down on one side, this companion cavalry, this extremely aggressive, highly skilled and motivated Macedonian cavalry, wheels around to the rear of the Persian line and it looks for weak points. So, for example, there might be certain parts in this clash where the Macedonian phalanx is advancing more. So they would go and smash into that. They would smash into the rear of the Persians at that point. And in the dust and chaos of battle, it's very easy for panicked troops who are being literally pushed back to rout and flee. And so by hitting these weak points again and again, repeatedly, hitting, wheeling back, gaining your breath, coming back and hitting them again, they were basically able to shatter the Persian line. And the result was, of course, a rout. And that rout essentially meant a massacre as the cavalry and some of the infantry chased the Persians and killed lots of them as they fled. So that's a typical example of how deadly these tactics were. Now, for something like this to work, one, you absolutely need to, all your commanders, everybody needs to know exactly what's going to be done. And should also be able to anticipate unexpected things that might happen. They should be able to make sense of what's going on in the dust and chaos of the battle. This requires, while this might sound simple when I'm talking about it right now, to actually execute it requires a great deal of practice, talent, and skill. One possible shortcoming that is, I think, evident already is that once this sort of plan is set in motion, it's very difficult for commanders to take initiative, to react to something new that is happening on the battlefield. This is, in that sense, a fairly rigid system. It's a very effective system, and it works brilliantly against the Persians, but there is also a certain rigidity to it.
That's really fascinating. And one thing that this really reminds me of, especially in terms of the need for a very clear command structure, the need for coordination between all these different units, the need for initiative on part of the commanders, and more importantly, the fact that it works. When it works so well against much larger numbers of enemies. It kind of reminds me of the Mongols in a way, and I feel like though Genghis Khan today is very often thought of as essentially this barbarian despoiler who just went and wrecked everything, and Alexander in contrast is thought of as this enlightened conqueror almost. The fact is that by the standards of the day, Alexander was essentially a Genghis Khan. He was essentially a guy who had managed to unite a people who had never been united before. He managed to work them into a system that was highly meritocratic, highly organized, and he unleashed this military system on the greatest powers of the world to fairly extraordinary effect. And he did not shy back from using absolute and horrifying ruthlessness to get his way. So these are people who come from essentially the outsides of the civilized world to take on the greatest civilization of the world, Persia at the time, and they absolutely rampage over the entirety of Persia. They destroy and burn to the ground the great Persian capital, including many of its what would have been priceless administrative and historical records. And they reach the very edges of what the Greeks thought of as a civilized world, namely India. Now, what happened after the death of Alexander is something that we have talked about in another episode of All Things Policy. We talked about the Seleucids and how the Seleucids basically the Seleucids and other successors of Alexander started to import war elephants, and there was this very intense age of warfare over the last couple of centuries before the Common Era, where you had all these successor states fighting with variations basically of these massive phalanxes and cavalry. So basically, the entire Eastern Mediterranean, the Hellenistic world is called, basically begins to fight warfare using this highly effective kind of combined arms tactics with the phalanx and cavalry and some light infantry and also war elephants. But let's leave the Hellenes for a little while, Aditya, and look far off to the west, where a tiny little muddy city on seven hills is starting to make its career. Let's talk about the Romans, who, as the historically inclined among our listeners would know, became one of the dominant empires of the Western world. How was it that the Romans eventually developed a system that would be able to take on the Macedonians?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating subject, and it's not just fascinating to us; it was fascinating to the ancients. Polybius asks this very same question in his histories. In the surviving volumes that we have, he very much asks the question of why on earth were these Romans and their legions able to defeat the phalanxes which had been so successful. I think we can take Polybius's lead in this and go a little further based on our understanding of how Roman legions operated. And I'm not going to go into the details again. As with the Macedonians, there's no time to go into the details of command structure and how these armies were organized. But in the third and second centuries BC, when Rome was, like you said, this little provincial town of mud huts and wooden buildings, you basically had a kind of citizen militia, but a remarkably effective kind of citizen militia. If you're looking for a modern equivalent of these people in terms of their culture, in terms of their combat commitment, their motivation, I think you'd probably look to maybe North Vietnam in the 1940s to 60s, right? These are people who are able to lose battles but still win wars. They're extremely resilient. They keep coming back for more. So there's something there that's very hard for us to quantify. But they're extraordinarily committed soldiers, and they're citizen militias. They're not full-time soldiers, but think of their military duty as a normal part of their lives. They also don't expect quarter or give quarter to their enemies. Extremely ferocious warrior culture. They also tend to value as much as possible individual combat. Now, you can't actually go and fight individual combat and win wars in the ancient world when you're dealing with complicated states, right? So armies are organized in very specific ways, and if you go and try and engage in individual combat by yourself, you're just going to get killed. So the Romans figure out how to harness this into the legions. The legions are, unlike phalanxes, much more loose order formation. There's more distance between the soldiers that gives them space to fight with swords, short swords instead of spears. The Romans also use a large shield, though unlike the typical phalanx shield, it's an oval-shaped shield, which is also curved backwards. And the Romans basically use this like a punching glove, right? It's actually one of their weapons. It's not just meant to be used defensively. There are clear accounts of Romans using their shield to hit and push down or knock down enemies and then skewer them with their short swords. They would use these short swords typically most often as thrusting weapons, which is something that you can do for a longer period of time than, for example, picturesquely swinging your sword, which would not just expose yourself but would also tire you out very quickly. So that's broadly how these people would fight individually. It's also really interesting that the Romans had a three-tier system for their infantry. So you would have the youngest, least experienced, but also most eager people right in the front. You'd have slightly older, perhaps more experienced people in the middle, and right at the back you would have the most experienced people, the most steady people, the people who would hold the line even at a moment of crisis. And these people would typically be armed with spears, short spears, sort of like a Greek hoplite, rather than with a short sword like the rest of the Roman legions. So this was a very interesting system, and it allowed for a bunch of things. One is it allowed for a much looser order formation into which the skirmishers could enter and exit more easily. It also, from what we understand, allowed for better circulation of troops in the sense that, you can't keep fighting forever, right? Human beings tire. So as they tire, as fighting peters out for a few minutes on both sides, the legions had a very flexible means of getting the fresher troops, the people who haven't been engaged, right up to the front to engage in the fighting once again. So it's a very flexible system. It doesn't have the forward momentum, the deadly forward momentum of the Macedonian phalanx, and it suffers for it. But it has a great deal of flexibility. Also, unlike a lot of phalanxes, the Greek phalanx, which with a shorter spear, it was hard enough to turn and face an enemy on the other side with it. The Macedonian phalanx, it was basically impossible. The Roman legions can basically turn and fight in any direction because everybody's on all sides are basically armed with, say, in a rectangle of people, a rectangle of human beings, a century, which is typically about 60 men. You can turn to any side and fight your enemy. So it's also an extremely flexible way of fighting.
That's really fascinating. And it's also interesting to think about the fact that just as the Greeks had a particular way of fighting and that evolved into the phalanx because of kind of comparative pressures, similarly the Romans developed this way of fighting while warring against all the city-states of Italy, and then eventually picked up various aspects of their equipment and organization from fighting with the Celtiberian tribes. So once again, we're seeing essentially two diverging evolutionary forms of warfare as a result of different kind of comparative and selective pressures. And what happens when these eventually come together, Aditya? What happens when the Romans eventually become aggressive enough to enter into the Balkans and then come head to head with the Macedonian phalanx? Who wins in this matchup and why?
Well, yes. So the Romans win, spoiler alert. But what's really interesting is how. And in the initial clashes, the initial big clashes in the 3rd century BC between these typical Macedonian pike phalanxes and the Romans, it's a close call. The so-called Pyrrhic victory of Pyrrhus comes from one of those battles where the Roman legions and the Macedonian phalanxes clash. But what is interesting already by this point is that the Romans do seem to be faring better than, for example, the Persians. There could be a lot of reasons for this. Could be simply the fact that the Macedonians are not able to muster the kind of highly motivated, highly capable cavalry that, for example, in the heydays, Alexander could. But I don't think that's all of it. Part of the explanation is definitely that the Romans are able to at least delay the forward momentum of the phalanxes. They are able to get in between the pikes, smash them, start inflicting casualties on the men in the phalanx, and so on. You do get some sense of how this is possible from an actual event that happened in I think it was 325 BC in Uch, in what is now southern Punjab, when Alexander's armies were in India. Like you pointed out, these are extremely savage people, basically thugs. And there's this drunken brawl between an Athenian named Dioxippos and a Macedonian named Koragos. And the short story is that these two guys get into a fight. The Macedonian picks up his big pike and points it at the Athenian. The Athenian basically charges past the pike, pushes it aside, and then smashes it with a club and shatters it, and then is able to close the distance with the Macedonian and wrestle him down. So, now take that and multiply it by several hundreds. So you have on the one side the Macedonian pike phalanx moving forward right into the Romans, and then you have the Romans moving in twos and threes right into this hedgerow really of phalanx is a very deadly place to be in, and using their shields to smash down these pikes and shatter them, and then going and inflicting casualties, inflicting wounds on the men in the phalanx. So this is probably one of the ways in which they managed to delay or slow down the phalanx, and then use other arms of their military to gain advantage, perhaps use terrain in some cases. So that's broadly what happens in the 3rd century. Now, at the end of the 3rd century, of course, you have the Titanic clash of the Western Mediterranean, the Second Punic War, between Rome and Carthage. And this is a fairly transformative war because it's in a sense Rome's real coming out party. This is the point where they start expanding, where their militaries start to get a lot more competent, not just in things like fighting, but matters of logistics, matters of strategy. They start doing a lot more sophisticated fieldcraft. They start scouting for their enemies more effectively, and so on. And by the 2nd century BC, in 3 battles especially, Kenos, Kephale, Magnesia, and Pydna, you start seeing the Romans very consistently defeating the Macedonian pike phalanx. And we'll just talk briefly about the one that's probably best known, which is Kenisokephale. Kenisokephale is in northern Greece and the Thessalian mountains. And this particular place has these rolling hills. And what happened was you had the armies of the Macedonians and the Romans basically searching for each other. They had camped not too far from each other on different sides of this ridge, which featured these little rolling hills. And it rained that night. Nobody could figure out where the other side was. And by the time morning came, there was a thick blanket of fog all across the area. And so both sides sent out scouts right to the ridge in order to, basically figure out where their enemy was. And the scouts bumped into each other. They called for reinforcements. There was another clash. Most of these clashes involved either, allied auxiliary infantry, light infantry, or cavalry. And now, at this point, both sides start to muster up their heavy infantry to go and quickly take the ridge and gain some battlefield advantage. It's not all that easy because not everybody's prepared. Not everybody has full information. On the Macedonian side, half of the phalangites are actually out foraging because they don't expect to fight that day. And so you have so the Macedonians form one wing on their right and march up this ridge. And they're met by Romans. And once again, the forward momentum of the phalanx is absolutely deadly. They push the Romans back very bloodily down the slope. What happens on the other side seems to be almost now at this stage it looks like the battle is going very much in the favor of the Macedonians because the rest of the Macedonians have been quickly called back from wherever they've gone foraging, and they're quickly forming up to take up the rest of the ridge, right, to form the full Macedonian line. And as they're rushing to form up, as their pikes start showing up on the skyline right above the ridge, the Romans are also rushing in as fast as possible. Now, what is really striking to us over here is that for both sides, by the way, to just get those people into any kind of formation and move them on that ridge just tells you how sophisticated their command and control system was and how disciplined their soldiers were. I mean, you just have to say these are not people you can trifle with on either side. What's interesting on the Roman side is their legions give them much more flexibility. So, the small rectangles, the small groups of legions can operate more independently than the phalanx, and they're in much looser order formation. So they can quickly form up and still be very deadly instruments of fighting. And so they're able to get into those Macedonians right even before they form a solid line. And they're able to hit these Macedonians where it hurts them most, on their sides and their rear, because it's very difficult for these guys to, pick up those big pikes, turn them around in time. So the Macedonians are absolutely slaughtered on one side, and the Romans start chasing them, to basically try and kill as many as possible. Now, another really interesting thing that happens here is that there's an unnamed tribune, basically a senior military commander on the Roman side, who takes supposedly 20 manacles. Some people think that this would have equaled about 2,400. I actually think that it would probably have been half that number because they were taking the very back of the Roman line. These guys were typically half the number of the other formations. I won't go into the details, but basically about 1,000 men went and crashed into the Macedonians to their left, who were basically so effectively driving down other Romans. And so suddenly the battle turns. So on the one side, the Romans smash up the Macedonians before they're able to form up. And then they just peel off a small number of soldiers to go and hit the Macedonians, even in the spot where they're being successful. And it results in a rout. There's something like 700 Romans killed in that battle versus about 8,000 Macedonians. Another 5,000 Macedonians are captured. It's a completely one-sided victory.
Wow, there's just so much going on here, but let's try to focus on the big picture implications of everything that you just said, Aditya. So I alluded a little earlier to how essentially you have these very divergent kind of formations and battle systems, as it were, emerging in these two very different contexts, right? So, and when I say battle systems, I don't just mean the actual tactics on formations, but also everything else that goes into battle, the entire martial culture, the societal organization that goes into it. We talked about how for the Romans you had this tripartite division, as it were, with the least experienced, more experienced, most experienced guys of various different social backgrounds, an interesting command and control structure. And we also briefly touched upon how in the Hellenic world you needed to have this very organized kind of command and control structure as well, which over the course of the Hellenistic period after the death of Alexander evolved to also become a social structure where it was integral to the edifice of kingship and society to have or to have served in the army in various ways. So think of them as two organisms, if you will, almost in a parallel to biological evolution. You see both these organisms, both these species, as it were, evolving in response to their environment in order to compete more effectively and thus replicate themselves over many, many generations. But because the Romans are shaped in a rather different environment as compared to the Greeks, who after figuring out this particular thing, after creating this highly specialized creature that is the Macedonian phalanx, they don't necessarily have to compete in anything that can really force them to evolve, whereas the Romans are constantly evolving and innovating. And just as you see in nature, very often when you have a highly specialized species that can do only one particular thing very well in one particular set of conditions, the Romans, in comparison, are a much more flexible and intelligent organism that can do many more things in many different conditions. When these two eventually come to clash, it's always the more flexible organism that ends up winning out. That is exactly what happens with the clash of the Romans and the Greeks. And that is what powers the Roman war machine to dominance over the Western and the Eastern Mediterranean, and powers it to really become an empire that lasts for centuries and arguably one of the most influential polities that has ever been seen in human history. So thank you for this journey, Aditya. Thank you so much for these fascinating insights. As always, there will be a couple of links in the description. So I highly recommend you check out our podcast, Yuddha, if you're more interested in learning about Indian military history. On that note, thank you so much, Aditya.
Thank you, Anirudh. Awesome conversation.
And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors very quickly this week, thewholetruthfoods.com, Storytel, and Siet. We really do appreciate your support. And we had a great week on the network this week. So tune in for some sweetness with our hosts Sadaf and Archit as they hone their sweet tooth and talk about candies. The famous, the healthy, the traditional, and international. Check out Naan Curry. You'll enjoy it. On last week's episode of The Note, Maruk and I spoke to TV presenter and columnist Veer Sanghvi, who analyzed the 2 years of the second term of the Modi government. As China and India signed the disengagement agreement along the LAC, Lieutenant General Dr. Prakash Menon and Manoj Kewalramani joined Suyash Desai to discuss the process and the consequences it will have on the nation and in world politics. Dr. Anton Harder joins Hamsini Hariharan on States of Anarchy to discuss India's right to a seat at the United States Security Council. Ashton Doctor talks about duty, how individually it binds us and how as a society it is liberating. Check out The Habit Coach with Ashton every day. Great show and great fun to listen to that. On Football Show, to all the boys to talk about their loves and sorrows for teams and their current ranks in the world of football. And also do remember to check out Cyrus Says. We had a great week last week. We had Amol Mazumdar, the ex-cricketer. We had Rocky and Mayur. And we did the Valentine special with Aisha and Kunal. Great fun. Do check it out. I'm sure you will enjoy that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.